Individuality is a sin, Carl Jung once declared, a statement so provocative it demands our immediate attention. In a world that ostensibly celebrates uniqueness and self-expression, why would Jung suggest that becoming truly ourselves is considered transgressive? Why might the journey toward psychological authenticity be met not with applause, but with subtle and sometimes not so subtle resistance from the very society that claims to value individuality? Tonight, we continue our exploration of Jung's revolutionary psychology by examining one of his most confronting insights: society's fundamental discomfort with genuine individuation. Building on our previous discussions of the shadow, projection, the curse of consciousness, the anima and animus, prophetic dreams, the inflated ego, collective psychology, happiness-seeking, spiritual experience, the unconscious as warning system, and synchronicity, we now turn to the social dimension of psychological development, the often invisible forces that oppose our journey toward authentic selfhood. What you'll discover may explain many of the subtle and overt pressures you've experienced when attempted to express your genuine nature. And by the end, you'll understand why Jung considered social opposition to authentic individuality not as a sign you're going wrong, but paradoxically as confirmation you're moving in exactly the right direction. The crime of being different, society's fear of authentic individuality. To appreciate why society consistently opposes genuine individuation, we must first understand what Jung actually meant by personality or authentic individuality. Contrary to our culture's shallow conception of individuality as mere stylistic differentiation through consumer choices or social identity, Jung understood it as something far more profound: the full expression of a person's innate psychological uniqueness integrated with universal human potentials. As Jung wrote in The Development of Personality, personality is the supreme realization of the innate idiosyncrasy of a living being. It is an act of high courage flung in the face of life, the absolute affirmation of all that constitutes the individual. This supreme realization involves not just expressing one's conscious preferences or cultivating a distinctive personal style, but integrating previously unconscious elements into a more comprehensive wholeness. It means bringing into consciousness aspects of oneself that may contradict both social norms and one's previous self-concept, a process that inevitably creates tension with collective expectations. Jung observed that societies systematically discourage this deeper individuation through various mechanisms of social control, not because they are deliberately oppressive, though they sometimes are, but because genuine psychological individuality threatens something fundamental to social cohesion: the primacy of collective values, identities, and behavioral norms. As he explained in The Undiscovered Self, the more a man's life is shaped by the collective norm, the greater is his individual immorality. This paradoxical statement captures a profound psychological insight. From society's perspective, developing genuine individuality constitutes a form of moral failure, not because it violates specific ethical principles, but because it inherently elevates individual psychological truth above collective values and expectations. The truly individuated person doesn't reject ethics, but their moral compass becomes internally grounded rather than externally imposed, a shift that collective structures inherently experience as threatening. Why does society experience authentic individuality as threatening? Jung identified several specific reasons. First, genuine individuation undermines the unconscious psychological projections that maintain collective identity. Groups maintain cohesion partly through shared projection of shadow material onto designated outgroups or enemies. The person who withdraws these projections through shadow integration inevitably creates discomfort by implicitly challenging the collective projections that sustain group identity. Consider how political movements, religious communities, or even corporate cultures often maintain cohesion through shared beliefs about the problematic nature of some external other. The individual who refuses to participate in these projections, who sees nuance where the group demands black and white thinking, will inevitably be experienced as threatening the group's psychological foundations. Second, authentic individuality challenges the conscious and unconscious games of mutual pretense that enable social functioning. Most social interactions involve what sociologist Irving Goffman called face work, the collaborative maintenance of socially acceptable personas that conceal psychological realities, potentially disruptive to smooth social functioning. The person pursuing genuine individuation increasingly finds it difficult to maintain these social pretenses. Their growing authenticity doesn't necessarily make them confrontational or rude, but it does make them less willing to participate in collective denial of uncomfortable truths, whether these involve personal dynamics, organizational dysfunctions, or broader cultural contradictions. Third, true individuation threatens existing power structures by creating psychological independence. Systems of control, whether political, religious, or economic, rely on compliance stemming from unconscious identification with collective narratives. The individuated person who has differentiated from these unconscious identifications becomes dramatically more difficult to manipulate through appeals to collective identity, fear, or desire for approval. As Jung noted in Civilization in Transition, where the many are, there is security. What the many believe must of course be true. What the many want must be worth striving for, and necessary, and therefore good. The individuated person no longer automatically accepts these collective assumptions. They evaluate situations based on their own psychological truth, rather than collective agreement. This psychological autonomy represents an implicit challenge to systems that require uncritical acceptance of collective narratives to maintain control. Fourth, and perhaps most fundamentally, authentic individuation reveals the profound uncertainty at the heart of human existence. The truly individuated person has confronted existential questions without the comfort of predetermined answers. They have developed comfort with ambiguity, paradox, and the fundamentally mysterious nature of being. This tolerance for uncertainty and mystery directly challenges the psychological function of collective certainties, the shared beliefs that shield us from confronting the inherent ambiguity of existence. When everyone agrees on specific answers to life's fundamental questions, the collective creates a comforting illusion of certainty. The individuated person who holds these questions open rather than clinging to fixed answers implicitly challenges this collective defense mechanism. The combined effect of these factors explains why, as Jung observed, societies consistently oppose true psychological individuation despite ostensibly valuing individuality. The sin of authentic personality isn't violation of specific moral rules, but the more fundamental transgression of elevating individual psychological truth above collective certainty and conformity. In our next section, we'll explore the specific forms this social opposition takes, how it manifests in both obvious and subtle ways across different relationship contexts. But first, consider this question. When have you experienced opposition for expressing aspects of your authentic self? How might Jung's perspective explain these experiences as more than personal rejection, but as manifestations of deeper social resistance to genuine individuation? The masks of opposition. How society resists authentic individuality. Jung observed that social opposition to genuine individuation rarely appears as direct prohibition. More commonly, it manifests through subtle yet powerful psychological pressures that work to contain authentic personality within socially acceptable boundaries. Recognizing these patterns helps us understand why the journey toward genuine selfhood often feels like swimming against an invisible current. The first and perhaps most fundamental form of opposition comes from what Jung called participation mystique, the unconscious psychological merger with collective identity that precedes individual consciousness. This state represents not a conscious choice, but our natural psychological starting point. We begin life embedded in collective psychology, and individuation requires differentiating from this unconscious merger, a process that generates both internal and external resistance, as Jung wrote in The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious. The first stage of individuation leads to the experience of the shadow. This stage is perhaps the most essential, since it is absolutely impossible to control one's own being if one does not know what it is. This differentiation from collective identity typically triggers what sociologists call soft sanctions, subtle social signals communicating that one's authentic expression violates unwritten rules. These might include changes in conversational tone, momentary awkward silences, shifts in body language, or subtle withdrawal of warmth and approval. Signals so slight they're easily dismissed, yet powerful enough to create deep psychological discomfort. Consider Hannah, a corporate lawyer who began expressing more authentic perspectives in team meetings after significant shadow work and therapy. Nobody explicitly criticized her contributions, but she noticed subtle changes in how colleagues responded. Slightly longer pauses after she spoke, fewer direct engagements with her ideas, occasional glances exchanged between others. These nearly invisible signals communicated more powerfully than direct criticism that her authentic expression was making others uncomfortable. The second form of opposition emerges through pathologization, the labeling of authentic individuality as psychological dysfunction or disorder. Jung observed that society often categorizes genuine psychological development beyond conventional norms as illness rather than growth, a pattern that has only intensified in our era of increasing medicalization of human experience. As Jung noted in the practice of psychotherapy, the patient must realize that his own individual life is not an endless repetition of the pattern followed by the species, but a process of transformation which he carries through as his own adventure, a unique experiment with no precedent to guide him. This unique experiment frequently attracts diagnostic labels when it contradicts collective expectations. The person experiencing natural grief beyond conventional time frames gets labeled as having complicated bereavement. The individual whose psychological development includes transpersonal dimensions may be considered psychotic rather than engaging with deeper aspects of the psyche. The child whose learning style doesn't match standardized education might be diagnosed with attention deficits rather than recognized as having a different cognitive orientation. These diagnostic frameworks often contain valuable insights, but when applied rigidly, they can function as sophisticated mechanisms for containing authentic psychological development within socially acceptable parameters, defining genuine individuation that transcends conventional norms as pathology rather than growth. The third form of opposition manifests through trivialization, the reduction of authentic psychological expression to shallow social identity or lifestyle choice. Jung observed that society often neutralizes the revolutionary potential of genuine individuation by recategorizing it as mere stylistic differentiation that leaves fundamental social structures unchallenged. Consider how profoundly transformative psychological insights regularly become diluted into self-help platitudes, how spiritual practices that originally facilitated genuine transformation get reduced to stress management techniques, or how authentic artistic expression becomes commodified into lifestyle branding. This trivialization transforms potentially revolutionary authenticity into socially acceptable forms of individuality that don't fundamentally challenge collective assumptions. The fourth, and often most painful form of opposition, emerges in intimate relationships, where authentic individuation frequently triggers what family systems theorists call homeostatic pressure, unconscious efforts to maintain established relational patterns even when these patterns no longer serve psychological health. As Jung wrote in 2 essays on analytical psychology, individuation cuts one off from personal conformity and hence from collectivity. That is the guilt which the individual leaves behind him for the world. That is the guilt he must endeavor to redeem. This guilt manifests concretely through the often subtle ways family, friends, romantic partners, and close colleagues unconsciously resist significant psychological growth that disrupts established relationship dynamics. The family member who has always played a particular role, the responsible one, the peacemaker, the scapegoat, will face powerful systemic pressure when authentic development leads them to transcend this role. Not because others consciously oppose their growth, but because this growth requires uncomfortable adaptation from the entire system. These various forms of opposition create what Jung called the collective shadow cast over authentic individuation, the subtle yet pervasive social messaging that becoming fully ourselves constitutes a transgression against collective values, expectations, and psychological comfort. This shadow explains why the journey toward authentic personality often feels mysteriously difficult despite nominal social support for being yourself. In our next section, we'll explore why Jung considered this opposition not as an obstacle to overcome, but as a necessary aspect of genuine individuation, a friction that actually facilitates psychological development rather than merely hindering it. But first, consider this question. Which forms of social opposition to your authentic self-expression have you experienced most powerfully? How might recognizing these patterns as systemic rather than merely personal change your relationship to this opposition? The necessary resistance. Why opposition serves individuation. We now arrive at Jung's most counterintuitive insight about social opposition to authentic individuality. This resistance isn't merely an obstacle to overcome, but a necessary element of genuine psychological development. The friction created by social resistance actually serves the individuation process, providing both crucial information and essential developmental pressure. As Jung wrote in the Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, the attainment of consciousness was the most precious fruit of the tree of knowledge, the magical weapon which gave man victory over the earth, and which we hope will give him a still greater victory over himself. This victory over himself requires precisely the resistance that society provides, not because opposition makes individuation easier, but because it creates the necessary conditions for differentiating authentic personality from both collective norms and unconscious identification. Without this resistance, individuation remains incomplete, a theoretical possibility rather than lived psychological reality. Jung identified several specific ways that social opposition serves the individuation process. First, resistance provides essential feedback about which aspects of our authentic expression create tension with collective expectations. This feedback isn't about what we should change to accommodate others, but about where our genuine psychological truth differs from collective assumptions, information crucial for clarifying our unique psychological position in relation to collective norms. When authentic expression triggers social discomfort, this response reveals the boundary between individual and collective psychology more clearly than comfortable acceptance ever could. Like a scientist mapping an invisible field by observing its effects, we discover the contours of our authentic personality, partly through noticing where it creates friction with collective expectations. Second, opposition strengthens psychological muscles necessary for maintaining authentic personality amid social pressure. Jung observed that genuine individuation requires developing what he called moral courage, the capacity to maintain psychological truth, even when this creates tension with external expectations. This courage develops through exercise, not theory, making resistance a necessary training ground rather than merely an obstacle. As Jung noted in The Development of Personality, resistance to the organized mass can be affected only by the man who is as well organized in his individuality as the mass itself. This organization of individuality doesn't happen in a vacuum, but through the developmental pressure created by social resistance. Like physical muscles that develop through working against resistance rather than its absence, the psychological capacities required for authentic individuality strengthen through engagement with opposing forces, rather than their removal. Third, social opposition serves as protection against inflation. The psychological danger of identifying ego consciousness with archetypal contents. Genuine individuation involves engaging with powerful archetypal energies that transcend individual consciousness. Without the grounding feedback of social reality, this engagement can lead to dangerous psychological inflation, where the ego mistakes itself for the self. The friction of social reality helps maintain crucial distinction between individual authenticity and grandiose self-importance. The truly individuated person doesn't claim special status or exemption from human limitations, but develops authentic relationship with both personal uniqueness and shared humanity. Social resistance helps maintain this balance by challenging inflated self-concepts not aligned with genuine individuation. Fourth, and perhaps most profound, opposition reveals whether our alleged authenticity stems from genuine psychological development or merely rebellious persona. Jung observed that authentic individuality differs fundamentally from both conventional conformity and its mirror image, reactive nonconformity. Both conformity and anti-conformity remain defined by collective norms, either through acceptance or opposition, rather than representing genuine psychological individuation. True authenticity emerges not from reflexive opposition to convention, but from psychological necessity. Expression of genuine inner truth, regardless of whether it happens to align with or contradict collective expectations in any particular instance. Social resistance helps clarify whether our supposedly authentic expression stems from this psychological necessity, or merely performs differentiation for its own sake. Consider Thomas, an academic who initially understood his intellectual disagreements with department colleagues as expressions of authentic individuality. The consistent opposition he encountered seemed to confirm Jung's perspective that society resists genuine individuation. However, deeper psychological work revealed that his contrarian positions often stem not from authentic conviction, but from unconscious oppositional identity formed in childhood family dynamics. The truly transformative development came not from maintaining these reactive positions, but from discovering his genuine psychological perspective beyond both conventional agreement and reflexive opposition. This authentic position sometimes aligned with colleagues' views and sometimes contradicted them, but stemmed from inner psychological truth rather than either conformity or anti-conformity. This example illustrates Jung's crucial insight. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. The resistance we encounter often reflects not simple external opposition to our authenticity, but complex interaction between inner and outer factors. A relationship that can only be clarified through conscious engagement with the friction itself. In this sense, social opposition serves not merely as challenge to overcome, but as essential dialogue partner in the individuation process, providing feedback, developmental pressure, protection against inflation, and clarification of genuine authenticity versus reactive persona. This understanding transforms our relationship with resistance from simple adversarial model to recognition of its paradoxical service to the very development it appears to oppose. As Jung wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, the foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering. The discomfort created by social opposition to authentic individuality represents precisely such legitimate suffering, not punishment for transgression, but necessary aspect of developing genuine psychological individuality in social context. In our next section, we'll explore practical approaches to engaging with social resistance as developmental opportunity rather than merely obstacle. But first, consider this question. How might your relationship with opposition to your authentic self-expression change if you viewed this resistance not just as obstacle to overcome, but as potentially valuable feedback for clarifying and strengthening your genuine individuality? Dancing with resistance, practical approaches to social opposition. If social resistance serves necessary functions in the individuation process, how might we engage with it productively, rather than either capitulating to its pressure or reflexively opposing it? Jung offered several practical approaches that transform engagement with social opposition from mere obstacle course into developmental opportunity. The first approach involves developing what Jung called psychological mindedness, the capacity to perceive social dynamics through psychological rather than merely personal lens. This perspective recognizes opposition not simply as personal rejection, but as systemic response to the inherent tension between individual authenticity and collective expectations. Practice this mindedness by asking questions like, what collective values or assumptions might my authentic expression be challenging? What psychological projection might be getting activated by my individuation? What unconscious group dynamics might be responding to my authentic self-expression? These questions shift focus from personalized hurt or defensive reaction to understanding the deeper psychological currents at play. Consider Rebecca, a woman whose increasing psychological authenticity following significant inner work created unexpected tension in her long-term friendship group. Initial hurt and confusion transformed through psychological mindedness into recognition that her changing relationship with conformity was challenging the group's unconscious agreement to maintain certain collective defenses and pretenses. This understanding didn't eliminate discomfort, but transformed her relationship with the opposition from personal rejection to comprehensible psychological pattern. The second approach involves what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension of opposites without prematurely resolving it through either capitulation or rigid opposition. This function develops through consciously experiencing the uncomfortable tension between authentic self-expression and social expectations, without immediately trying to eliminate this tension through compromise, conformity, or reactive rebellion. Practice this capacity by intentionally holding awareness of both your authentic impulse and the social resistance it generates without immediately acting to resolve this tension. Notice how this holding creates space for new possibilities to emerge that transcend simple opposition between authenticity and social acceptance. Possibilities that incorporate elements of both while being reduced to neither. Michael, a corporate executive who discovered authentic values significantly different from his organization's culture, initially believed his options were limited to either suppressing his authenticity to maintain his position or leaving the organization entirely. Through practicing the transcendent function, holding the tension between authentic expression and organizational expectations without immediate resolution, he gradually discovered creative third possibilities that neither compromised his authenticity nor required complete separation. The third approach involves distinguishing between what Jung called persona, the social mask we present to others, and authentic personality. Not to eliminate persona entirely, which would create dysfunctional social interaction, but to develop conscious rather than unconscious relationship with it. Jung didn't advocate discarding all social adaptation in favor of raw authenticity. He recognized that functional social interaction requires maintaining certain boundaries between inner experience and outer expression. The crucial distinction is whether this boundary represents conscious choice in service of both authentic selfhood and functional social interaction, or unconscious conformity at the expense of genuine individuality. Practice this conscious relationship with persona by asking, what aspects of my authentic self am I choosing not to express in this particular social context, and why? Is this choice serving both my authentic development and appropriate social functioning, or merely avoiding discomfort? What alternative forms of expression might better serve both authenticity and social relationship? The fourth approach involves developing what contemporary psychologists call response flexibility, the capacity to choose responses to social opposition rather than reacting from unconscious patterns. This flexibility creates space for engagement with resistance that neither reflexively conforms to social pressure nor automatically opposes it. Practice this flexibility by intentionally pausing when encountering opposition to authentic expression. Notice your immediate reactive impulse, whether toward conformity, confrontation, or withdrawal, without automatically acting on it. This pause creates space to choose response based on what genuinely serves your psychological development, rather than unconscious reaction patterns. Sarah, a naturally empathic therapist, discovered through personal psychological work an authentic capacity for directness and confrontation that initially created tension with colleagues accustomed to her previous accommodating style. Rather than either suppressing this authentic development or expressing it without regard for relationship, she developed flexible responses calibrated to specific situations, sometimes choosing direct expression despite discomfort it created, other times modulating expression without compromising underlying authenticity, depending on what each situation required for both genuine selfhood and effective professional function. Finally, Jung emphasized the importance of finding what he called appropriate containers for individuation, relationships, and contexts that provide sufficient safety for authentic development without eliminating the necessary friction that serves this development. These containers don't eliminate opposition, but create conditions where engagement with it becomes developmental opportunity rather than overwhelming threat. These containers might include therapeutic relationships, spiritual communities with genuine appreciation for individual development, creative collaborations that value authentic expression, or friendships that balance acceptance with honest feedback. The key characteristic isn't absence of challenge, but presence of basic psychological safety that allows productive engagement with necessary developmental friction. As Jung wrote in The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, the achievement of personality means nothing less than the optimum development of the whole individual human being. It is an act of high courage flung in the face of life, the absolute affirmation of all that constitutes the individual, the most successful adaptation to the universal conditions of existence, coupled with the greatest possible freedom of self-determination. This optimum development requires neither complete conformity to social expectations nor their wholesale rejection, but conscious engagement with the creative tension between individual authenticity and collective life, a dance with resistance that transforms opposition from mere obstacle into essential element of genuine psychological development. The sign you're going right. Opposition as confirmation of authentic direction. We began with Jung's provocative statement that individuality is a sin, the insight that becoming truly ourselves inevitably creates tension with collective expectations despite nominal cultural support for being yourself. We've explored why society systematically opposes genuine individuation, how this opposition manifests across different contexts, and why Jung considered this resistance not merely obstacle, but necessary aspect of psychological development. Now, we arrive at his most liberating insight. Social opposition to authentic individuality often confirms we're moving in exactly the right direction. As Jung wrote in The Development of Personality, the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. This struggle serves not just as unavoidable challenge, but as crucial feedback, confirmation that we're genuinely engaging with the lifelong process of becoming psychologically individual, rather than merely performing socially acceptable versions of uniqueness that don't fundamentally challenge collective assumptions. When authentic self-expression generates little or no resistance, it may indicate we're expressing aspects of individuality that remain safely within collectively approved parameters. Differentiation that doesn't fundamentally threaten collective identity or unconscious projections. While not inherently problematic, this comfortable acceptance doesn't provide the developmental friction necessary for genuine psychological individuation. Conversely, when authentic expression consistently generates subtle or overt opposition, despite reasonable social skills and genuine good faith, this resistance often indicates we're touching genuine boundaries between individual psychological truth and collective expectations, precisely the territory where true individuation occurs. As Jung noted in 2 essays on analytical psychology, individuation is not that you become an ego. You would then become an individualist. You know, an individualist is a man who did not succeed in individuating. He is a philosophically distilled egotist. Individuation means becoming a self. This distinction between egotist and genuine self proves crucial for understanding opposition as confirmation of authentic direction. The individualist pursuing ego-driven differentiation for its own sake typically generates resistance based on their violation of appropriate social consideration, rather than authentic psychological necessity. This resistance indicates not successful individuation, but its absence, the substitution of ego-driven nonconformity for genuine psychological development. By contrast, the person pursuing authentic individuation generates resistance specifically where their genuine psychological truth challenges collective assumptions, projections, or defenses, not because they're deliberately provocative or socially unskilled, but because genuine psychological development inherently creates tension with collective patterns. This understanding transforms our relationship with social opposition from discouraging obstacle to potentially confirming feedback. Not that all resistance indicates authentic direction, but that consistent opposition to good faith authentic expression often confirms we're engaging with genuine individuation rather than merely performing socially acceptable differentiation or narcissistic nonconformity. Consider Martin, whose authentic expression in his religious community increasingly generated subtle opposition despite his genuine commitment to the tradition and sincere efforts toward respectful communication. This resistance emerged precisely where his authentic psychological development led him toward questions and perspectives that challenged not the tradition's core values, but its unconscious psychological projections and collective defenses. The opposition he encountered, while uncomfortable, confirmed he was engaging with genuine psychological development, rather than either thoughtlessly conforming to tradition or rebelliously opposing it. His authentic position included both deep appreciation for the tradition's wisdom and inability to participate in certain collective projections or pretenses, a genuinely individual stance that neither reflexively accepted nor rejected collective patterns, but engaged them from authentic psychological perspective. This confirmation function of opposition proves particularly valuable during the confusion that often accompanies authentic psychological development. The individuation process frequently includes periods of profound disorientation as previous identities and certainties dissolve before new integration emerges. During these transitions, external feedback becomes especially important for discerning authentic direction from mere psychological confusion or inflation. The consistent yet specific opposition that emerges around authentic self-expression provides precisely such feedback. Not that we should seek opposition for its own sake or value it as universal indicator of correctness, but that the particular quality of resistance to genuine individuation often confirms engagement with authentic psychological development, rather than mere ego-driven differentiation or unconscious conformity. As Jung wrote in The Integration of the Personality, there is no light without shadow and no psychic wholeness without imperfection. To round itself out, life calls not for perfection, but for completeness. And for this, the thorn in the flesh is needed, the suffering of defects without which there is no progress and no ascent. The social opposition we encounter when pursuing authentic individuality often represents precisely this thorn in the flesh, not punishment for transgression, but necessary aspect of the developmental process itself. Its consistent presence, when our expression stems from genuine psychological necessity rather than mere rebellion or provocation, frequently confirms we're engaging with the genuine individuation process, rather than either unconscious conformity or its mirror image, reactive nonconformity. This understanding doesn't eliminate the discomfort of encountering resistance, but it transforms our relationship with this discomfort from discouraging setback to potentially confirming feedback, evidence that we're engaged with the genuine psychological development Jung considered the supreme realization of the innate idiosyncrasy of a living being, rather than mere performance of socially acceptable individuality that leaves collective patterns fundamentally unchallenged. As you reflect on tonight's exploration of Jung's perspective on social opposition to authentic individuality, consider this question. How might your relationship with the resistance you encounter change if you viewed it not merely as obstacle to overcome, but as potential confirmation that you're engaged with genuine psychological development? What forms of opposition in your life might actually indicate you're moving in exactly the right direction toward authentic selfhood? Remember, Jung's core insight: the social opposition we encounter when expressing authentic individuality often confirms we're engaged with genuine psychological development, rather than mere performance of acceptable differentiation or reactive nonconformity. Not that all resistance indicates authentic direction, but that the consistent yet specific opposition to good faith authentic expression frequently confirms engagement with the genuine individuation process, the lifelong journey toward becoming not who others expect us to be, but who we authentically are. In a culture that simultaneously celebrates superficial uniqueness while systematically opposing genuine psychological individuality, this understanding offers crucial orientation, recognition that the sin of authentic personality represents not failure or transgression, but the courage to engage with what Jung called the privilege of a lifetime, to become who you truly are. What form of authentic self-expression might you be avoiding precisely because of the opposition it generates? And how might your life change if you recognize this opposition not as evidence you're going wrong, but as confirmation you're moving in exactly the right direction?